They buried power inside the family. They made marriage an accounting tool. 5 brothers, 5 cities, one hidden rule. Don't let money wander. What looks like loyalty was a balance sheet. What looks like tradition was a legal strategy. By the time Europe learned their name, the Rothschilds had already rewritten how dynastic capital survives and how secrecy is enforced. Listen closely. In the beginning, there were ledgers, letters, couriers, and a retardant hush. Then came war, a single violent morning at Waterloo, and a moment where information moved faster than armies. That gain became institutionalized. And over 2 centuries, something else happened. The great vault they had built cracked, not because of theft or revolution, but because time, law, and families do what families do. Wealth, multiplied by blood, fractured into hundreds of hands, hidden in trusts and shells that speak only to a select few. This is how they got rich. This is how they tried to keep it. And this is how it started to evaporate. Picture Frankfurt, late 1700s. A merchant named Mayer Amschel Rothschild runs a counting house under a red shield. Coins clink in the dark. He trains his sons to read ledgers like scripture. He teaches them to move money like a convoy moves troops, quietly, efficiently, with redundancy. When Napoleon scatters regimes across Europe, Mayer's sons scatter too, to London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and stay put. The placement is deliberate. A node in every capital, a line into every state. They did not create a multinational in the modern sense. They created a family relay. Each son was both banker and agent. Each branch kept accounts, but shared intelligence. Letters crossed borders faster than armies. Trusted couriers carried tidings of interest rates, of enemy movements, of the price of bullion. The brothers built a network not through public offices, but through kinship, secrecy, and a shared interest in preventing capital from leaking sideways through marriage settlements or inheritance claims. The technique had 2 parts. One was operational, speed and coordination. The other was structural, keeping capital in the vault. Operationally, they exploited information asymmetry, the old economic advantage where early information is convertible into profit. During the Napoleonic Wars, that advantage became explicit. At Waterloo in June 1815, a message from the battlefield reached London before the public did. Nathan Rothschild, based in London, learned of Wellington's victory sooner than most. With faster information came opportunities, short-term trades in government securities, rapid movement of bullion, financing the British state when it needed liquidity. Accounts of the day record a frenzied market reaction. Historians argue about exact trades and the morality of the move. What matters is the lesson the Rothschilds drew. Information, when wired into capital markets through a trusted family network, is itself a perpetual revenue source. Now the structural piece, the secret deliberate design that many later failed dynasties would attempt to replicate or resist. Mayer's children and grandchildren did something radical for a European banking family. They internalized marriage. Instead of scattering wealth across unrelated lines through exogamous unions, they encouraged cousin marriages and intra-family alliances. A dowry was not merely a gift. It was a capital transfer retained as an equity-like contribution to a family partnership. Prenuptial agreements, marriage contracts, trusts, and contingent survivorship clauses all served to convert social vows into legalized capital protection. Think of it as financial endogamy. The Rothschild household became a web where property rights and marriage vows were knotted together. A daughter's wedding ring might also be an operational clause preventing her dowry from being claimed by an outside husband's creditors. A cousin's bride would sign away claims that could otherwise transfer ownership sideways. These were not romantic fairy tales, but deliberate, enforceable instruments drafted by notaries who understood both family and law. The immediate effect worked. In the short term, capital stayed within Rothschild-controlled entities. Their holdings could be consolidated, pledged, repledged, and used as collateral for loans to governments without fear that, at the next marriage feast, a portion of the collateral would walk out the door with a new in-law. The network's liquidity grew. Their ability to underwrite loans across borders, to acting as intermediaries for sovereign debt, was enhanced because the capital base felt, to them, secure. But there is a forensic economist's trick you should always remember. Retention is not the same as preservation. You can prevent lateral transfer, and you can control ownership structures, but you cannot freeze the law of large numbers. Children still have children. Siblings multiply. Each generation presents fresh claimants, and with each birth, the denominator of ownership grows unless an active policymaker compresses the numerator through forced concentration, strict primogeniture, perpetual entails, or draconian pooling rules. The Rothschild model used intrafamily marriage and legal structures to delay fragmentation, not to abolish it. So over the 19th century, the family did two seemingly contradictory things. They centralized operational power by placing relatives in key financial capitals and coordinating intelligence. And they decentralized economic ownership by creating multiple private banking houses, each controlled locally but woven into a family compact. That compact rested on trust, secrecy, and law. Secrecy had different tools over time. Early on, it was leather-bound ledgers and ciphered correspondence. English and French notaries wrote contracts thick with conditional survivorship clauses. Later, secrecy migrated into jurisdictions, Swiss bank rooms, shell corporations in neutral states, and, more recently, trusts and foundations with complicated beneficiary definitions. Financial privacy and legal innovation are not the same as secrecy for malintent. They are, in many cases, protective technologies designed to preserve family wealth across volatile political eras. But protective technologies can, over decades, calcify into opacity. Now return to Waterloo. That episode is an emblem. Information arbitrage turned into institutional strategy. The payoff was not a single day's profit so much as a cultural lesson. Speed of information equals the power to underwrite risk. After that, the Rothschilds invested in human and technological systems to make speed routine. They placed agents in ports and courts. They relied on coded correspondence, and in some branches, they even used pigeons and fastboats. The business model of a modern merchant bank depends on access to information faster than the market. And the Rothschilds invented an early form of that business model. But then something quietly ingenious and quietly baffling took shape under the surface. The internal marriage model became a forensic problem generations later. Let me explain. When you analyze dynastic decline or diffusion, you can look at three levers: legal structures, demography, and external shocks. The Rothschilds had strong legal structures, trusts, family compacts, and marriage contracts designed to freeze wealth inside the family. They had demography, many children, many unions, which by itself increases fragmentation. And they had shocks, wars, taxes, expropriations, philanthropic commitments, and regulatory changes that depleted or redistributed capital. From the vantage of forensic economics, the internal marriage model postpones, but does not eliminate, dilution. It also creates a different problem: opacity. When wealth transfers repeatedly within a closed circle over generations, ownership records can become multi-layered. Company A is owned by Trust B, whose income is distributed to Foundation C, whose trustees include family members and registered agents. The legal tree becomes a thick, opaque hedge that hides beneficial ownership even as control is exercised through informal family compacts. For a forensic economist, that is a maintenance nightmare when your job is to trace capital. By the early 20th century, family courts, taxes, and politics had started to gnaw at the edges. The Rothschild branches invested in railroads, mines, and state debts. They underwrote governments. They bought estates. But wars change everything. 2 world wars, estate taxation, and changing social norms about philanthropy and marriage loosened the knot. Some family members married outside the dynasty. Some donated art and property to museums. Some accepted political positions that required disclosure. And then, as the 20th century advanced, wealth management sophisticated into modern family offices and trusts designed precisely to distribute benefits to many beneficiaries while keeping decision rights concentrated. That solved one problem and created another. The money stayed powerful, but its visible footprint retreated into private spaces. Pause for a second and imagine a researcher in 2024 combing through archives. They pull a bundle of correspondence from 1815, a ledger from 1860, a trust deed from 1953, a corporate registry entry from 1998, and a Swiss fiduciary statement from 2005. Each document on its own is legible. Together, they form a tangled genealogy of property. The modern twist is that the legendary fortune is now scattered among hundreds of heirs and hidden trusts. The power is diluted and difficult to trace. Motives that once seemed monolithic, keep it in the family, now yield a plurality of outcomes. Private art collections, university endowments, small business holdings, and philanthropic foundations that cast long shadows but do not behave like a single corporate behemoth. Let's return to the forensic toolbox for a moment. How would you map a family fortune like this if you were an investigator? You start with a small visible point, a public shareholding, a philanthropic donation, a property record. From there, you follow the money through company filings, probate records, historical marriage contracts, and rarely seen trust instruments. Each step requires cross-jurisdictional requests, often awkward diplomacy, and sometimes private disclosure. That is why modern disclosure regimes, beneficial ownership registries, trusts registers, matter so much. They turn the complicated palimpsest of historical contractual arrangements into traceable threads. And yet, many of those threads remain hidden by design. But secrecy alone is not the whole story. Social choices matter. Over generations, many Rothschild heirs chose private lives. They married outside the family. They divided estates intentionally to avoid the appearance of dynastic power. They gave to public causes. They placed assets into philanthropic vehicles that diminished concentrated control while preserving cultural influence. If power is the capacity to move markets, influence policy, and underwrite states, the Rothschilds in the 19th century demonstrated concentrated capacity. In the 21st century, many family members preferred anonymity, stewardship, and sometimes modesty. The wealth was not entirely destroyed. It was diversified into personal projects and fiduciary entities that do not read like a single, monolithic fortune. Halfway through this story, a small request. If this kind of forensic history interests you, consider subscribing. There are more deep dives that trace how money and secrecy shape history. It helps keep this research independent and quiet, like a ledger hidden in an attic. Back to the arc. The forensic lesson here is dual. First, legal engineering. Marriage contracts, trusts, and family compacts can slow and shape the flow of capital. Second, they cannot indefinitely resist entropy. Over time, complexity becomes opacity, and opacity becomes fragility. The more you bury ownership, the harder it is to reassemble that ownership in a time of crisis. Trusts can hide beneficiaries, but they also multiply the number of stakeholders who must agree when consolidation is needed. Internal marriage creates short-term concentration, but it also leads to intertwined claims that are messy to unwind. A few human scenes help crystallize this. Imagine a private dinner in the 1850s with Rothschild cousins around an oak table in a Vienna salon. They discuss sovereign loans to build railways in Argentina. Each cousin signs a note. They laugh, drink, and sleep well because the capital is theirs, collectively. Jump forward to the 1950s. A descendant opens a letter with a lawyer's statement about taxation. The numbers are different. The legal advice: put assets into a trust, diversify into new sectors, consider philanthropy to reduce the estate tax bite. The moral tone has shifted from preserve and control to manage and distribute. By the 21st century, those same assets are split into art holdings in a London foundation, philanthropic trusts in Geneva, minority stakes in banks and wine estates in Bordeaux, each administered by family offices and fiduciaries, each with their own bylaws. There's also a reputational calculus. In the 19th century, a banking dynasty thrived on being reliable, discreet, and impenetrable. In the modern era, reputational exposure is immediate. Sometimes privacy itself becomes suspicious. So parts of the family leaned into public philanthropy as a way of legitimizing wealth, while other parts defended privacy more fiercely. The result is not neat. It is human, messy, and surprisingly modern. The family's influence is both diffuse and deeply embedded. As we enter the final third, notice the emotional contour. Secrecy once felt like strength. Over time, it produced loneliness and legal entanglement. Arranging marriages to keep money in the family preserved capital across generations, but it also shaped personal lives. That matter-of-fact engineering of relationship had costs, constrained choice, complex duties, and sometimes tragic personal outcomes. That human dimension softens the purely economic story and makes it relevant to anyone who studies legacies, financial or otherwise. So what do we take away? The Rothschilds invented techniques that magnified information and secured capital. They showed how family networks could serve as instruments of national finance and how secrecy could be a functional element of wealth preservation. But their story also shows the limits of secrecy as a long-term strategy. Legal instruments can preserve value for a time. Demography and social change eventually diffuse it. The farther we look into the family's modern footprint, the less we see of a single concentrated fortune, and the more we see a mosaic. Hundreds of heirs, trust structures, private foundations, stakes in businesses big and small. Power, once centralized behind a counting house door, became distributed across generations. If what we've explored here leaves you wanting to dig into the records with me, to unspool one ledger at a time, there are more episodes that do just that. Subscribe quietly, and you'll be the first to hear the next archival reveal. To close, imagine the original 5 brothers again, standing at the thresholds of their cities, each holding a line of credit, each a node in a living network. They built an invisible apparatus that redefined how states borrow and how information trades. They invented marital law as a defensive asset. They taught us that secrecy can be engineered and that engineering has limits. The Rothschild story is not a thriller about hidden masters. It is a forensic case study in human ingenuity applied to money, how legal forms, family ties, and communication technologies can concentrate power, and how time, new laws, changing social norms, and simple arithmetic can quietly erode that concentration. In the end, the lesson is less about conspiracy and more about fragility. Dynastic power can be created by design, but it cannot be preserved by design alone. The family's greatest invention, internal marriage and legal secrecy, bought centuries of privacy and control. What it never quite bought was immortality. If you found this investigation worthwhile, consider subscribing and sharing this episode with someone who likes history through the lens of money and law. There are more ledger stories waiting in the archives. Thank you for listening.